Welcome back. We'll now proceed with the third panel of today's hearing. Mr. LeBaron.
Chairman Hertzman, witness panel 3 is composed of the following individuals from my left nearest the Board of Inquiry. Dr. Kathy Abbott from the Federal Aviation Administration, Mr. Stephen Boyd from the Federal Aviation Administration, Captain Dave McKinney from International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations, Mr. Bob Myers from the Boeing Company, and Dr. Nadine Sarter from the University of Michigan. The NTSB technical panel is composed of, starting on my right, Mr. Bill English, Mr. Chong Kwan Park, Dr. William Bramble, the panel lead, Captain Roger Cox, and Mr. John DeLisi. I now ask that the witnesses please stand to be sworn. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth? If so, answer I do. You may be seated. Chairman Hertzman, these witnesses have been pre-qualified and their respective experience and qualifications appear in the dockets as exhibits in Group 1. I now turn the questioning over to Dr. William Bramble.
Good afternoon. Panel 3 will address effects and influence of automation on human performance. And we will begin the questioning with Dr. Nadine Sarter from the University of Michigan. Dr. Sarter, you're an expert in human performance and automation-related issues. Could you please describe for us the positive and negative effects of automation on human performance?
That's correct. The positive negative effects of automation on human performance. Obviously, we know that automation can be extremely supportive of human operators if it is designed properly. It can help perform tasks that a human might not normally be capable of even performing on their own. So in that sense, properly designed automation is a very supportive thing for human performance. But we also have seen in a number of incidents and accidents that if not designed in a certain way, automation can actually get in the way. We have heard things like clumsy automation, where automation is designed in such a way that it helps the most when the pilot actually might need the help the least. But when they need the help the most in very time-critical conditions, it might be very difficult for them to actually operate the automation, instruct the automation. So in that sense, it can actually get in the way, if you will, in those kinds of circumstances. So it depends on
Dr. Sarter, could you pull the mic just a little closer?
Oh, sure. So I would say that the effect that the automation has depends to a very large extent on its specific implementation and the specific tasks that it's being designed for, as well as the level of autonomy that you assign to the automated system.
What types of error are commonly associated with the use of auto-flight systems?
One of the most well-known and most discussed ones would probably be mode errors. Mode errors basically being a failure in mode awareness, where mode awareness is the knowledge and understanding of the current and future state of the automation. And a mode error would then mean that you perform an action that is appropriate for the assumed state of the automation.
Dr. Sarter, could you slow down just a little bit for the translation, please?
I will do my very
you.
best. Thank you. So mode awareness basically being that you are aware of the current and future state of the automation. And if you're not, then that might lead to a mode error, where you perform an action that is appropriate for the assumed but not for the actual state of the automation.
Are these types of problems, mode errors and mode confusion, are they unique to one particular airplane manufacturer?
No, as a matter of fact, if you look across incidents, accidents, and the research that has been conducted, these types of problems have been observed on a large number of different flight decks with lots of different circumstances, and again repeatedly shown for various types of pilots at different levels of experience.
What factors influence the probability of such errors?
The most often discussed and most studied ones would be one factor is called observability, which is contrasted with what we call data availability. In other words, you might provide all the data that the pilot may need, but if you don't do it in such a way that it is pre-processed and properly presented to the pilot, then all you achieve is data availability, and what you need is observability. Another one that has often been discussed and mentioned today as well is, let's say, gaps and misunderstandings or misconceptions in pilots' mental model of how the automation works. Another one would be a high level of complexity and coupling of the automation. And then finally, the one I mentioned earlier, which is a very high level of autonomy of the automated system.
Have you studied the visual scanning patterns of airline pilots?
Yes, in fact, there are unfortunately very few studies, but there have been, to my knowledge, 3 major studies that have looked at these scanning patterns and scanning performance. And what they basically across the board show is that one tendency that pilots tend to have is that they monitor the raw data on the airplane performance much more than they actually look at the flight mode enunciations that were mentioned earlier. So we have done a study, for example, where we have worked with 20 747 pilots. We had them fly a 1-hour flight in a flight simulator, and we introduced several events during the scenario, and one of the things that we observed was that only about 50% of the flight mode enunciations were actually fixated on by the pilots, so 50%. And the other thing also that we noticed, and I think that is something that hasn't been mentioned enough today yet, is that it isn't only about whether they see the enunciation. So what we found, for example, was that we introduced certain transitions in the automation mode, and one of the things that we saw was that, especially during the late phase of descent, 10 pilots actually noticed a transition that we had introduced, which was inappropriate. They noticed, they looked at it, 10 looked at it, but only one of those 10 pilots noticed actually that the enunciation was inappropriate.
And in general, in studies of dual task or multiple task performance, where part of the task is automated and part of it is manual, how do automation and workload tend to influence scanning, visual scanning?
So the way that we find they tend to scan is really based on expectations. And so the higher the workload, of course, the harder it is for them to anyway take in all of the information that is provided. So there's a high risk of data overload, especially since so much is presented in the visual domain. But the monitoring on these flight decks tends to be not the usual standard scanning pattern, but it tends to be very much top-down, expectation-driven monitoring. So if a pilot expects the automation to do a certain thing, then they will look for an indication to confirm that. But if they don't expect anything to happen, then they will also not look at that indication that is associated with it.
Have you studied accidents involving mode confusion errors?
I have certainly reviewed a number of the reports on different accidents, and I think one of the important things to again point out, you mentioned earlier, none of this is about a particular flight deck or a particular pilot. I think what we see is there is a certain signature associated with complex system failures. And a lot of these accidents I would consider to be complex system failures. And if you go way back to pick on one, but I'm not saying it's the only one, in 1990, I believe, we had an accident that was very similar in nature in my mind. Certainly there were differences to this one, but there were a number of similarities as well. The airplane crashed short of the runway, and it was at very low speed at the time. The auto thrust system was an idle open descent, or the autopilot system was an idle open descent. And the pilots basically noticed too late what mode the automation was in, and that had led them to a problem situation with, again, low speed and being short of the runway. And another similarity, as a final point on that, is that the pilot who was actually pilot flying was on the first of 10 flights to qualify as a pilot on this airplane. So there's a lot of similarities, I think, there.
In such accidents, what factors have allowed mode confusion errors to propagate to the point where an accident actually occurs?
To be honest, it would take me an hour to answer that question, because there isn't that one cause that I can give you. It usually is the combination. I think of it as there's a concept called defenses in depth, where we look at In order to avoid these accidents, we introduce layers and layers of defenses into a system. Some might be training, some design, some procedures. And in a way, it takes all of these different things to come together for one of these accidents to happen. That's why they are so rare. But on certain days, all of these things come together. But the specific factors that lead to it vary, and that's why on the surface, that's the risk. On the surface, the accidents look different from one another. And it hides the fact that there are underlying common patterns, I think.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move the questioning on to Dr. Kathy Abbott of the FAA. And I just remind all of the witnesses to try and speak slowly for the interpreters. Dr. Abbott, what effect do you feel flight deck automation has had on airline safety in the United States?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the question. Automated systems have been successfully used for many years, not just in the United States, but worldwide.
Dr. Abbott, can you pull the microphone closer to you?
Okay. And I'll try to speak up. Automated systems have been successfully used for many years worldwide, not just in the U.S., and they have contributed significantly to improvements in safety, operational efficiency, and precise flight path management. However, certain aspects of pilot use of and interaction with automated systems have been found to have some vulnerability areas.
Can you describe the history of the FAA and industry efforts to examine automation-related safety issues over the last 2 decades?
In 1996, the FAA published the Human Factors Team Report on the interfaces between flight crews and modern flight deck systems. That report looked at highly automated aircraft, and it looked across different manufacturers, different operators, and so on. That was an important document that had a number of recommendations that have been acted on since then. In addition, the Air Transport Association Automation Subcommittee produced 4 papers on recommended practices for training and use of automated systems. Since then, there has also been an effort by the Commercial Aviation Safety Team looking at safety enhancement number 30. That was a recommended safety enhancement to look at automation and produced a report on mode awareness and automation policy for airlines. Finally, the one that I'd like to mention is in 2006, the FAA tasked the PARC, the Performance-Based Operations Aviation Rulemaking Committee, and the CAST, Commercial Aviation Safety Team, to create a working group called the Flight Deck Automation Working Group to analyze operational use of and training for flight path management systems.
What involvement did you have in the 1996 study on the interface between flight crews and modern flight deck systems?
At the time, I was with NASA Langley Research Center, and I was the NASA co-chair of the team that did the 1996 report.
And what was the purpose of the study?
The purpose of the study was to look at the modern aircraft systems to find out why we were seeing accidents with aircraft that were not seeing any failures, or not necessarily any failures, and seemed to stem from the interaction between the pilots and the aircraft systems. So the intent was to do an analysis across the different aircraft types and look at the operations.
And can you give me a brief overview of the types of findings and recommendations that came out of that report?
Some of the findings and recommendations that came out of that report were related to pilot situation awareness with respect to automated systems and pilot management of automated systems. And we made recommendations with respect to flight deck design, regulatory improvements, pilot training, and safety data collection and analysis.
And what major actions were taken in the 10 years between the publication of the 96 report and the kickoff of the Flight Deck Automation Working Group by the PARC in 2006?
There have been a number of regulatory updates that have happened. Since then, there have been updates to 14 CFR 25.1329 on flight guidance systems, which includes autopilots, auto throttle, auto thrust systems, and flight directors. Also updates to 25.1322 on flight deck alerting systems, updates to Advisory Circular 2511 on electronic flight deck displays, and the development of a new regulation addressing design-related pilot error, and that is 14 CFR 25.1302.
Okay, turning our attention to the Flight Deck Automation Working Group report. That was a group activity that began in 2006, and the report was just released within the last month of 2013. What was your role in this group?
I was the FAA co-chair of that group.
Okay, and in your opinion, why did it take 17 years to update the 96 report?
Well, regulatory activities can take quite a while. The rulemaking process is a very deliberative process that takes time to work through, so those actions were in work and implemented. In addition, there have been improvements in training, some of which were a result of the 1996 report, and it takes time for those to work through the system. So the intent was to say, we've given it time for the changes to take effect. How have they affected the operational use of these systems?
What organizations were represented in the Flight Deck Automation Working Group?
We had airframe and avionics manufacturers. We had various operators. We had pilots, including an ALPA co-chair who is a member of this panel. FAA representatives from aircraft certification, flight standards, and air traffic. And we had several researchers on the group.
And what was the title of the group's final product?
Operational use of flight path management systems.
Was this a consensus product?
It was concurred to by all working group members and their organizations.
Did Boeing have representation on the working group?
Yes.
Can you give us a brief overview of the findings and recommendations in terms of categories of findings and recommendations from the report?
Yes, the working group did extensive analysis of operational and safety data from 1996 through 2009 and identified 28 findings and 18 recommendations in the areas of flight operations, pilot training and qualification, flight deck design, and data collection and analysis.
What did the Flight Deck Automation Working Group conclude about the role of pilots in maintaining the safety and effectiveness of the civil aviation system?
The working group identified that pilots contribute in a significant way to mitigating safety and operational risk in the aviation system, and the aviation system is designed to depend on that mitigation.
How about pilot interaction with automated systems? I understand that the group examined this issue and came up with a number of findings in this area. What vulnerabilities were identified?
We identified vulnerabilities in that pilots sometimes rely too much on the automated systems and may be reluctant to intervene. We saw that auto-flight mode confusion errors continue to occur, and we saw FMS programming and usage errors continue to occur, as well as others.
You mentioned some findings involving flight deck design as well. What challenges did the group identify in this area?
We identified that current flight deck designs have incorporated many safety and operational improvements with the increase of additional technologies that are available now. However, the data suggests that the highly integrated nature of current flight decks and additional add-on features and retrofits in older aircraft have increased flight crew knowledge requirements and introduced complexity that sometimes results in pilot confusion and errors in flight deck operations.
Did the group identify any issues involving transfer of learning across aircraft types and different flight deck designs?
We did identify that it is important for pilot training and knowledge to improve that knowledge to understand exactly what their background is. We didn't get into the specifics of moving from one type to another type.
Okay, let's talk about some of the recommendations that came out of the report. What strategies did the group recommend to improve flight crew mode awareness and reduce human automation interaction errors?
For the near term, the working group recommended that we emphasize and encourage improved training and operational procedures to improve mode awareness as part of an emphasis on flight path management. For the longer term, the working group recommended equipment design should emphasize reducing the number and complexity of the auto flight modes from the pilot's perspective and improve feedback to pilots.
Were there any recommendations to manufacturers in terms of how, what they should strive for in terms of design philosophy?
We did not specifically get into philosophy except to say that inclusion of considerations for human-centered design needs to be part of the process.
What shortcomings did the Flight Deck Automation Working Group find with respect to manufacturers' incorporation of human factors expertise in the flight deck design process?
We looked at that specifically in the context of what has happened since 1996, and we found that human factors expertise has been increasingly incorporated into the design process at most manufacturers, but is still inconsistently applied at some manufacturers. Furthermore, human factors specialists or human factors expertise may not exist in some organizations or is called in very late in the process.
And what happens when such specialists are called in late in the design process?
Makes it challenging to resolve those issues. It's much more difficult to address them late in the design process.
You mentioned the FAA's new certification rule on design-induced pilot error, 14 CFR 25.1302. Can you describe the contents of this new rule?
25.1302 is titled Installed Systems and Equipment for Use by the Flight Crew, and that characterizes some of the scope of the regulation. It includes uniform standards that address design for flight crew error in transport category aircraft. It has 4 subsections. The first 3 describe design standards for avoiding design-related flight crew error in the flight deck design. The 4th subsection addresses management of errors that do occur because of the recognition that even with well-trained crews and well-designed systems, errors will still occur.
How will this new rule affect flight deck design and certification processes?
This new regulation advocates a methodical approach to the certification for design-related human performance issues. It is specifically targeted at that, and the design would be according to that certification process.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to turn the questioning to Captain McKinney. Captain McKinney, what role did you play in the Flight Deck Automation Working Group?
I was the ALPA co-chair of the group.
What did the Flight Deck Automation Working Group conclude about the evolution of flight deck equipment and how the evolution of flight deck equipment and operations has affected pilot knowledge and skill requirements?
Can I get the exhibit 14-E, page 40, please? And what we concluded was that the pilot skills evolve over time, and the changes in the aircraft equipment and the scope of our flight operations, together with the complexity of the airspace procedures and automated tools on the flight decks, has resulted in a corresponding increase in our required skills and knowledge that the pilots need for flight path and energy management for today's complex aircraft. So we also saw that this increase in pilot knowledge and skills is not diminished as a result of the automated systems, but has actually increased. And it also requires the pilots to even be more of a pilot and also be a systems-to-systems manager, where we have to not only control the aircraft, but also manage the additional systems that have been put on in the flight deck.
And what did the group find regarding the adequacy of current training time, methods, and content?
Well, we found in the analysis of the 26 accidents and 20 incidents that the 40% of the accidents and 30% of the major incidents had some type of knowledge deficit of the pilots. And it wasn't that the pilots, they didn't know or weren't trained properly in some phase that affected flight path management. And there's an incomplete, in some of the things that we summarized from our interviews of the 18 different training organizations that we saw was the incomplete understanding of complex relationships and modes of flight director, autopilot, autothrottle, and autothrust, and flight management system computers, including such things as systems and limitations, the operating procedures, and the need for confirmation and cross-verification, as well as the mode transitions and behavior.
What training improvements did the group recommend to improve flight crew autoflight mode awareness and reduce human automation interaction errors?
There was a long, there was a long list, and but the ones that are kind of pertinent to this would be the knowledge about when to use various combinations of the automated systems, the situations that can lead to distractions, and strategies to prevent and mitigate these distractions both on the ground and in flight. Knowledge related to the mode logic and maintaining awareness of the state of the system modes, task workload management, automation management, automated system mode management, and decision making.
I noticed in the report that there was also a finding about, or a recommendation about developing or enhancing flight crew documentation, training, and procedures for FMS use. Can you describe that in more detail?
Can you repeat that question, please?
There was a recommendation about developing or enhancing flight crew documentation, training, and procedures for FMS use.
Oh, okay, yes. I think it was that there's been very little research that's been done in that field, I think, and we were requesting that, or recommending that we look at that, and so we can tell instructors, teach them how to effectively teach the mode transitions.
What vulnerabilities did the Flight Deck Automation Working Group identify in the area of pilot knowledge and skills pertaining to manual flight operations?
The first part, I think, is that the pilots, what we saw, I mean, and even what I heard this morning is a good example, is that the pilots may be able to read, the pilots, read and are taught the systems knowledge, but the problem is that when they go through training and how they relate that to the actual line operations and controlling the flight path management is where we're lacking in our training. And what we're saying with the flight path management is that the way we've been affected with the training is that we train the pilots to operate the systems. We don't train the pilots well to actually how to fly or maintain the flight path of the aircraft using the automated system. So it's more that we interface with the system, but not how to actually use that, and especially in unexpected situations where they may find themselves not in the pristine environment that they are trained in the simulator.
Did the study also find vulnerabilities in pilot knowledge and skills in the areas of energy management?
Yes, they did.
How about manual handling after transition from automated control?
Yes.
Crew coordination, especially about aircraft control?
Yes, the problem with the crew coordination between the aircraft control was when they're flying, we saw a lot of things. Again, this is both from the accident and incident analysis as well as the interview with the organizations, which the interviews included the instructors and the evaluators. So the changeover is it's not necessarily who's flying the aircraft, but who, the question is, what are the automated systems doing at the time?
How about the definition, development, and retention of manual handling skills? Was that identified as an issue?
Yes, and that was it. It was the fact that the pilots are not given the opportunity. Sometimes with certain operators, we have to fly by our standard operating procedures, and if those procedures require us to use the highest level of automation at all times during our normal line operations, we don't get a chance to practice our manual handling operation skills.
What recommendations were made by the group in the area of manual flight operations?
Let me just bring that up because there was, again, another long list of...
Well, just from your own knowledge and experience with the group, what do you recall the group concluding could be done about this issue?
For the SAFO that was distributed, we had a finding and a recommendation both on the manual handling, and SAFO has since come out, which basically says for the airline operational policy should ensure that all pilots have the appropriate opportunities to exercise the aforementioned knowledge and skills in flight operations. And what we were saying as we defined the flight manual operations is it's not just the stick and rudder skills that everybody thinks it is. That's we also talked about the cognitive skills, the airmanship, how we fly the aircraft, how we use these automated systems to actually maintain the flight path. And so we have to think about the motor skill, the psychomotor skills, and the cognitive skills as part of this. And we need to train the pilots. We spend probably more time teaching them how to fly the automated systems and do the aircraft versus allowing them to practice these other skills. And I think if we look at a lot of our training programs, the amount of time spent flying approaches in manual flight operations, for example, in the simulators versus on the automation, which is what we do every day, you'll find that the automated systems is probably higher than the use of the manual handling. So we didn't give the pilots enough time to practice those skills. And we also did a co-occurrence analysis with the manual handling skills that we looked at. And it's interesting under this point that some of the things that co-occurred when we had manual handling operations issues was some crew coordination problems occurred, training was inadequate, behavior of automation was not apparent to pilots, understanding of automation was inadequate, the inadequate knowledge threat that we mentioned earlier, and cross-verification errors.
What lessons learned did the Flight Deck Automation Working Group identify with respect to the implementation of automation policies by airline operators?
As Nadine mentioned earlier, is if we think of our training system or the airspace here as a system across systems, is that we put a lot of those safety layers in there, and the operators' policies and procedures and training are all part of that. And what we found is that when we go across the board, some of those can be confusing to the pilots. And also even today, sitting in and listening this morning, is even with all of my instructor time and time flying, as I learned a few things today that I didn't know, which is quite interesting because the engineers and the way the aircraft are certified and the way they're taught to the pilots and the way the pilots understand how they work for us to do their job, there's a difference. And so what makes sense, and that's probably one of the areas that we're missing, which is kind of what we anticipated in here a little bit, or not anticipated, but we found from our analysis, is that what we intend to train the pilots and how to use that in operations sometimes does not match, and the pilots see something else.
So what did the group recommend? How did it recommend that airlines change their automation policies? I think in the last question you were addressing a little bit training, but yes. Also there's often a separate policy that directs pilots in terms of their general utilization of automation.
Yes, yeah. What we recommended was an operational policy for flight path management. Currently, probably every operator has a automation policy that they have where the pilots tend to be part of that automation policy, where the focus is more on the automation and how to use the automation than on the flight path management itself. So that became apparent as we looked across the system at the different factors of the accidents and incidents. And so what we are recommending is that we create an operational policy for flight path management, which highlights and stresses the responsibility that the flight path management rests with the pilot. And the automated systems are only tools. It's just one of the tools. You have your manual handling skills, the psychomotor skills. We have our cognitive skills. We have automated systems. All of those we can use, but our primary focus should be on the flight path management. And we need to flip our training around to put that focus back on. We also found that we were not the pilots were taught really to rely on the systems all the time, but they're not taught to, question the systems. So when they expect the system to work when they use it, and when it doesn't, then they get caught short. The other one is to identify appropriate opportunities for manual flight operations. So if a operator, for example, has a policy that says we use the highest level at all times, then they have to make sure that somewhere within the year or every few months or whatever, that the pilots have opportunities to practice those manual handling skills, both the cognitive and the psychomotor, and that's why we labeled that flight manual handling operations. So we have to make sure we allow that, otherwise the skills will degrade.
In 2012, Boeing published a study on airline pilot perceptions of training effectiveness. This study was conducted in cooperation with IFALPA and IATA. Did you have a role in that study?
Yes, I did, yes. The study was conducted by Dr. Barbara Holder of Boeing, and she is a invitee to the IFALPA Human Performance Committee, and she's one of their manufacturer representatives. And she was doing that on behalf of IATA and for us. So she came to our meeting, and we helped her review the questions that she had written to make sure we represent over 100 different countries. And we had pilots from all over the world at our meeting, so we made sure that the questions were reasonable, that they could be understood by the respondents. And once we did that, and she changed a few of the questions, I think, just to make sure that for readability, we hosted that on our website for the pilots to be able to take the survey.
Can you briefly describe the findings and conclusions?
Again, there were many, but relating to this case, it's the one question they asked about the training effectiveness for automated systems. 61% of the surveyed pilots reported multiple encounters of difficulty completing tasks using the FMS, for example, during line operations after training, while only 25% of the pilots said that they were adequately prepared. So what the study kind of showed is that a lot of the training for some of the automated systems is actually taking place during line operations and not in the actual training environment, which begs the question then is, if it's occurring on the line, what is actually being learned, and is it appropriate? Another one is that 42% said the learning occurred on the line, and some of the areas that came out of the study that said that they could be improved was in the area of automation surprises, and this is improved within the training before they go to line operations. They could receive extra training in automation surprises, hands-on use in operational situations, transition between modes, basic knowledge of the system, and MFS programming. And talking about monitoring and cross-verification was another issue. And for recurrent training, 99% of the pilots believed that monitoring and cross-verification were important skills, but only 47% responded that it was actually discussed during recurrent training.
Thank you. I'd like to turn the questioning now to Mr. Boyd of the FAA. Mr. Boyd, Dr. Abbott listed off a number of regulatory changes that have occurred since the publication of the 1996 report. Can you describe for us the new rule or revised rule 14 CFR 25.1329 and how it applied, if it applied to the 777 during its initial certification?
Yes, the new flight guidance rule 1329 went into effect at Amendment 25-119 in 2006. So that was more than 10 years after the 777 was certified. So the new version of that rule is not in the certification basis for the 777. That rule then, as Dr. Abbott described, updated and combined previous rules on autopilots and flight directors and added in new requirements for autothrust systems.
And were there any changes to the advisory circular on flight test certification AC 25-7 that would be related to flight deck design?
Yes, the flight test guide AC 25-7 existed in its original release at the time of the 777 certification. There are sections in that advisory circular that address such topics as aircraft performance, braking, handling qualities, a wide range of topics that are evaluated by the test pilots during the flight test program. At the time when the 777 was certificated, in that earlier release of the document, the sections associated with review of systems such as autopilots had not yet been populated. They were reserved for future development. About 3 years after the 777 was certificated, the A version of the advisory circular was released, and at that time, sections on autopilot systems were included in the advisory material. There was no guidance material on auto throttle systems because the guidance material was there to show compliance with the regulations, and at that time there were no regulations associated with auto throttle systems. Then most recently, after the new flight guidance rule was released in 2006, that AC was again revised to include additional guidance material for the auto throttle aspects of the new rule.
Thank you. Mr. Myers, I have about 2.5, 3 minutes remaining. How have Boeing flight deck design practices evolved as a result of what has been learned about pilot system interactions since the mid-1990s?
Since the mid-90s, our process has evolved somewhat. We have, since even before the mid-90s, way back to the 757, 767 development, have had a human-centered design approach. We have a organization that consists of human factors folks, of pilots, and of engineers, whose sole responsibility is to design the flight deck interface requirements. And that group does not have responsibility for supplier management and schedule and individual boxes and that kind of thing. So their focus is on a user-centered design. And that group works with the rest of the company and works with outside organizations, including our customer pilots from all over the world, not just in the U.S., but all over the world, and works with ALPA and IFALPA and NASA and FAA and other regulators, and we bring in folks from universities, researchers, human factors researchers. That's all part of our formal development process whenever we do a new airplane design or a major derivative. So that process it has been in place for a long time. We do evolve it as as things with each new program as the world evolves, and we try to support as best we can all of the activities that are going on in industry. The initiatives and the regulatory changes and the advisory circulars that were mentioned here at the table, Boeing has supported, I think, virtually all of those, and we update our product as we're able as those regulatory changes and advisory circulars are made.
Thank you very much. Mr. LeBaron, that concludes my initial questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Park.
In the exhibit 14D, page 24, please. I have a question to Professor Sata and Captain McKinney. And first, can you please look at the PPT? First of all, at 500 feet, the aircraft was at 137 knot, and the poppy light was on glide path, and at the 500 feet, everything was normal. 137 knot is 5 knot higher than the reference speed. And if you look at the slide, the bottom of the slide, this 500 feet is 34 seconds before the impact. And 34 seconds before the impact, the aircraft received the clearance of landing, and then according to the CBR script, there is a pilot communication. I will just read the script. Can you please think about what kind of thing had happened 34 seconds before the impact? And Professor Sata, can you please explain the human factors and the pilot's response to this action? And the captain, can you please explain your opinion in terms of from the perspective of the captain? Right before the 500 feet, the ACT gave the clearance of landing. And then an electronic voice was out at like 500. And the captain said landing checklist. And then the voice of minimum is generated from the aircraft. And the captain said that landing checklist complete and clear to land. And he said on glide path, sir. And another captain said that check. And the voice message of 200 was out from the aircraft and say yes, and that the voice of yes is heard. Can you please flip to the next page? The slide. Yes. If you look at the yellow box, there is a quadrant time. And there is a sound of beep, 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 beep. It was generated 11 seconds before the impact. 35 seconds before, it was 500 feet. And 11 seconds before the impact, a voice, the beeping sound of beep, 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 beep is generated. After that, the pilot, after heard the beeping sound, 4 seconds later, pushed the throttle to its maximum. And 3 seconds later, there was a warning alert, which is stick shaker activation for 2 seconds. And 2 seconds later, the airspeed increased. And another 2 seconds later, the aircraft struck the ground. I think in the sequence of this accident, the time that I explained all these situation even is more than 35 seconds. If you look at all this situation, Captain McKinney, do you think the pilot, do you think under which condition the pilot is? And Professor Sata, can you please explain the pilot's human factors and the response to this situation?
I'll answer. I just want to remind you that we're not performing analysis or speculating on the cause of this accident or the actions of this crew. And so what maybe we might want to do is have Mr. Park restate his question, that it might be in a more generic sense, that you can talk about your experience or your studies with other crew. And so I know you all are experts in the field. We just want to be cautious about the work that's happening in this room here. It's about gathering factual information, okay? So if you all want to take a stab at trying to kind of come up with an answer that might make sense, given those ground rules, you can do that, or I could go back to Mr. Park and ask him to rephrase. I will ask the people who've been asked the question, Captain McKinney and Dr. Sarter, what you would like to do. Do you want to provide a response, or do you want to rephrase?
I think I can provide a generic response.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Who wants to start? Okay. I got myself in trouble there. Okay. I think one of the things that is being highlighted, independent of this particular case, is something that I mentioned earlier. These kinds of accidents often have a certain signature, and one of the factors that tends to play a role is time constraints. So a lot of things happening in a very short period of time, and in addition to that, things happening that were not necessarily expected by the pilot. So we mentioned earlier, monitoring happens based on expectations. So we might find a pilot in some situations who does expect the automation to do certain things, which the automation does not do, because there are gaps and misconceptions about how the automation works. Even when they notice that the automation doesn't do what they thought it might be doing, they might have to, under very strong time constraints, try to figure out what is going on and why things are not working the way that they expect them to work. And in a way, all that falls under something that we refer to as disturbance management, which means that while they're trying to figure out what is going on under time constraints, they still have to basically keep the process going or keep the airplane flying, if you will. So there's an awful lot of attentional demands and cognitive demands imposed on operators at times, and they have to deal and cope with all of these demands under very high time constraints. I think that's the best generic answer I can give.
Okay, and I think I'll try to do the same. So what I found both from personal experience and also from our study here is that most times when we're flying approaches, we are given unexpected situations that basically the pilots have to deal with. That's why you need a well-trained and qualified pilot doing that, because we have to deal with the unexpected all the time. The approaches never really go as planned, so we're always making changes. And during times of high workload, which that is usually a result of those unexpected changes, and during a complex arrival or with distractions, there's a myriad of tasks that we have to do as pilots. And as I was learning this morning, is you may not always be staring at the primary flight displays and looking at your mode changes, because you're looking out for other airplanes, you're looking at the PAPIs, you're looking at the airspeed, and you're doing so many things that at some point you can't do everything that's required of you. So you do what I call risk management, or you do those tasks that you think have a higher risk, and those other ones that are being handled, say, by automated systems or whatever, you may give control over that, which is also what our study showed on some of the accidents and incidents that we looked at. So the other item is that so during high workload like that, and time pressures are also, because again, it's a very compressed time, as they said. So and the other thing is I want to talk about a little bit is which is generic about this is when we're trained and when we do the training, because I've done both, is if you look there, as say it's 500 feet or 1,000 feet or whatever, you're looking for a stabilized approach criteria. At that moment, it was there for the most part. There might have been a clue here or there, but for the pilots, if you hit all those parameters, we're trying to jump through this this goalpost, if you will. We got through the goalpost. But the question is, that wasn't good enough, because if there's one thing out or you get distracted or something else is gone and you don't catch it fast enough, even if you recognize all the alerts and warnings that we have, you respond as quickly as possible, and the aircraft responds, it's not enough time. So I think one of the things that our study showed a little bit too with some of the items, and again, some of this will be my personal opinion too, is that when we look at stabilized approaches, we need to back up and be looking at stabilized approach from, say, 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet. In our study, some of the airlines that we talked to actually took a lot of their stabilized approaches, analyzed them, and one particular airline said almost all of their stabilized approaches, they could take it all the way back to 15,000 to 16,000 feet. And they could tell right there that was going to be an unstabilized approach just because of the changes that were made to the arrival, the way the pilots responded to them, and everything that they had to do on the way in.
Chairman Hirschman, that's all we have at this time.
Thank you. We'll move to the parties. Asiana Airlines.
No questions. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Asiana Pilots Union.
Yes, Madam Chairman. Captain McKinney, are you familiar with the approach to runway 12 left at San Francisco?
Yes, I am.
If so, could you characterize the external distraction on this approach compared to external distraction during a visual approach at most other airports?
It's
Captain McKinney, could you repeat the question for everyone to make sure that we all heard it?
I think what I was going to answer, I hope it's correct, is he wanted me to talk about the approaches at 28 left or whatever compared to other approaches, I think. Is that correct? Is that?
Yeah, visual approach.
Visual approach. Visual approach. Okay. Yeah, coming into the San Francisco is the visual approaches there, depending on if it's 28 or 2 left, they're basically simultaneous, what we call simultaneous ILS approaches to between the runways, I think it's 500-600 feet. It's very narrow compared to most airports. So we basically come in from two different angles. And so as we're coming in, if you're coming in from, for example, 28 left, you're clearing for the people that are coming into 28 right. 28 left's coming in from over the water, from over the ocean. 28 right's coming in from over the mountains from the east. And so when we're coming in, they're trying, the air traffic control is trying to sequence us in. And what they normally do is they put, the regional in front of the big heavies, just so they don't get it the opposite way for wake turbulence. But a lot of time is spent, and it's distracting to us, trying to, instead of flying the approach, that you're actually trying to find the other airplane. So it distracts in the coordination between the crew, because we're trying to find that a lot of times. Again, if it's middle of the night and there's nobody there, that's fine. But normally it's there. The 28 right airplanes are coming in on an angle, and they actually have an offset arrival that they come in inside the bridge, inside 1,800 feet, and then they sidestep to the left to line up with 28 right. So it's kind of a very complicated one, and they're always in. We're usually high and fast because they can't let us down or intercept until they make sure that we have the other aircraft in sight. And with the weather conditions, sometimes, again, it depends, but a lot of times it's hard to pick up that other aircraft till you get pretty much over the San Francisco Bay.
But the conditions on this day were clear weather visual conditions, correct? What you're talking about is another other experience that you might have had.
Yeah, I was just answering it generically, okay. So I wasn't responding to this one.
I just want to make sure there's not confusion about what we're referencing.
But in response to that, even in visual, it's hard sometimes with the moisture and the mountains and the haze. Again, I don't know what the weather was that day because I wasn't there. But I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Great.
And this, could this higher level of external distraction have an impact on the flight crew use of automation during the approach?
Can you repeat that?
Could this higher level of external distraction have an impact on the flight crew use of automation during the approach?
Yes, it can.
Again, we want to not speculate about this accident crew in this circumstance, in this situation. So, if the people asking questions can try to help the panelists, and the panelists can avoid focusing on this accident when you're answering.
So if I answer the question, can distractions, because I think the question is, can distractions...
Okay, I'll give you next question.
Okay.
Okay. Captain McCanney, when an instructor captain is doing training, what is the priority of his responsibility? PIC, PM, instructor pilot?
Okay, the priorities of the instructor pilot. So is it instructor pilot, pilot monitoring, or pilot monitoring, or flying? Okay. They actually have to do all of them at the same time, but for the instructor pilot, it should normally be that they're making sure that the aircraft is safe and doing the pilot monitoring skill at the same time. And so they should be making sure that the flight path management is safe at all times.
What do you believe can be done to get pilot to go around when the approach is unstable?
Okay, repeat it once more.
Okay. What do you believe can be done to get pilot to go around when the approach is unstable?
So, if I understand it correctly, is what should be done to get the pilot to go around? So, with go-arounds in general, I think it should be, if I'm answering the question correctly, either pilot should be able to call a go-around at any time and any pilot, even a relief pilot, because I flew in augmented aircraft for 20-some years, is any pilot should be able to call for a go-around if they see it's unsafe. And obviously the pilot in command has the ultimate say-so if it's not, but the pilot flying, if they hear go-around, they should immediately execute a go-around. and or if they say they're going around, if they don't like the situation, they should immediately do a go around.